Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm Sophie, I'm the Professional Development Manager at English Australia, and I'd like to introduce the speaker for the session today, Dr. Pamela Humphreys. Pamela is the Director at Macquarie University International College and English Language Centre. She presented this session as a workshop at the English Australia Conference in 2018 in Melbourne, and she's also published a paper on the same topic in the April 2020 edition of the English Australia Journal. I'll pop the link for that paper into the chat when we get started. So before we start, I'd just like to let all attendees know that we will be sharing the PDF version of Pamela's slides after the session, and there'll also be a link available to the recording of today's presentation. Pamela will be stopping halfway through her presentation to see if anyone has any questions. So please type your questions into the chat as they occur to you, and then she'll address them halfway through the presentation. And then again, at the end, there'll be a Q&A session. Thank you very much, Pamela. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and hello, everybody. Very nice to be here to present Engage, Empower, Evolve, using a teaching philosophy to engage staff. So what I'm going to do first, just find my mouse. Okay, all right, there we go. So first I'm going to give you an overview of the session so that you know what to expect. And there's going to be two parts to the session. First of all, about developing an individual teaching philosophy. And then the second part will be about developing an institutional teaching philosophy, which is what we did here at the college. And I'm going to talk about, first of all, what is a teaching philosophy? I think we need to know, what do we mean by a teaching philosophy, and why should we write one, and how do we go about writing one? So what are some of the structures that we might use and approaches that we might use to write a teaching philosophy? And then part two, around developing the institutional philosophy, I'm going to talk to you about what approach we used here, and the outcomes of that, and the further institutional uses of the ensuing philosophy. And at the end, I'll talk about the lessons that we learned, because it wasn't perfect, and we learned a lot along the way, so that you can consider whether you would like to create an institutional philosophy. Okay, so we're going to start with the theory bit. Those of you who know me and you've seen me present before, you know that I like to make sure that whatever we talk about, although I'm a practitioner, a scholar practitioner, I feel it's always very important to ground whatever we do in the literature and the theory. So as Sophie just mentioned, I did publish an article in the English Australia Journal just a couple of months ago on this, and I strongly encourage you to go and read it. But just in terms of a summary of the literature around teaching philosophies, it's really that we know that teacher knowledge and beliefs and philosophies very much inform our teaching practice, and therefore they affect our student outcomes as well. So some of the models that you might be familiar with, for example, Borg's model of teacher cognition, describes the really complex relationship that there is between beliefs that teachers have and their knowledge and theories and conceptions. And Borg's model really identifies a range of factors that can impact that teacher cognition. So the literature has referred to these combined features of teacher cognition in lots of different ways, but I really like the term that Phil Chappell uses, the wisdom of practice, or the WOP. And the WOP, the wisdom of practice, is predominantly developed during our pre-service training, not surprisingly, when we're first being trained to become a teacher. And then, of course, our in-service teacher development programs continues to develop our WOP. And after a few years, a couple of years of teaching, our wisdom of practice really becomes very stable and deep-seated, and it becomes implicit as well, and we don't really revisit it again. So research has found that language teachers vary very much in their knowledge and their awareness of the teacher cognition, but it is something that we need to be aware of. Okay, so part one, we're going to look at developing an individual teaching philosophy. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first of all, I think we need to think about what a teaching philosophy is. What does it actually look like? And what role does it play? So a teaching philosophy it's a statement of your beliefs about teaching and learning. It also is a statement of your learners' goals and how you would operationalize or put into practice your beliefs. So those are the key things: your beliefs, teaching and learning, not just the teaching side, focusing on the learners and their goals and how you operationalize that. Typically, I mean, there's no single way to write one or create one, but typically it's quite short. It might be 1 to 2 pages, not particularly long. And it's written in the first person. So you would say, I. And I very much advocate a sincere and honest teaching philosophy, because otherwise it's pretty pointless if it's not very reflective, if it's not very specific. I've read some that can be full of cliches and platitudes, and I don't find that that's particularly useful. So the more concrete and sincere it can be, the better. And again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, I feel that it needs to be very much grounded in theory and the literature. So that's a typical structure, what it is. We also need to consider who we're writing the teaching philosophy for. So who is the audience? And in some cases, it may just be yourself, and that's fine. But as you'll see as the presentation goes on, there are actually a range of different people that you might be writing this teaching philosophy for, including yourself, but not only yourself. So you need to consider the audience and the intended purpose of the document that you create. All right, so let's think a little bit about theory again now. We visited it earlier, and I really like this learning theory map that Richard Millwall created, Richard Millwall's learning theories map. And if you like that, all you need to do is Google Richard Millwall learning theories. But I think this is a wonderful representation, very colorful, and it's not an exhaustive list, but as you can see, it talks about, it's a great place to start in terms of the different fields of the different disciplines. So for example, it's got education, linguistics, psychology, they're the ones in orange and the inner circle. You'll also notice some familiar names, such as, it depends on your background, but I'm sure you recognize names such as, you know, Vygotsky and Brunner, Skinner and Gardner, or Kolb, and perhaps some of the others. And it really depends on your background and your training, how many of those that you recognize. And then in blue, it talks about the learning paradigms or world views. And I think this is something that I can look at for hours, very interesting to look at in more detail. So if you're struggling with the theory part, when I've said it needs to be grounded in theory, then I recommend that you use this as a starting point. And in our staff rooms, we printed these out in A3 and we laminated them, and we gave them out to staff as part of a PD session. And we found that that was a very useful place to start. Okay, so why would we write a teaching philosophy? I'm going to suggest that there are two main, there's a range of reasons, but two main ways that we could divide them: summative and formative reasons. So first of all, summative reasons. And I think summative reasons for writing a teaching philosophy are probably often overlooked, but are becoming increasingly important. So for example, a job application might be considered a summative reason for writing a teaching philosophy. You may be asked to explicate your philosophy of teaching and learning in a job application as a criterion for the application. And you may, even more likely, be asked to talk about it at an interview. They may not say, tell us about your teaching philosophy, but essentially the question might really be trying to find out what you believe and what your teaching philosophy is. So I would say, and right now I know a lot of people in the industry and the sector are looking for work. And if that's the case, I think you really need to have a very clear view of how you would explain your personal teaching philosophy for an interview. Perhaps internally you might have you might call it PDR or your annual review, whatever you call it in your college. You may, as a teacher, be asked to reflect on your teaching philosophy as part of the annual review process and what has changed, if anything, during the year that you've reflected on and changed and honed as part of your teaching philosophy. Increasingly, you may enroll in some kind of qualification. You may choose to, if you're doing a pre-service qualification, there may be an assessment task that asks you to explicate your teaching philosophy. Or if you're a teacher trainer and you're training new teachers, you may add an assessment task around teaching philosophies in a pre-service qual. If you're going on to do, a diploma, the Delta, a master's degree, you may, again, as an assessment task, be asked to write a teaching philosophy. And you can see for all of these, the audience is quite different from writing a teaching philosophy just for yourself. Increasingly, and I'm very glad to say, because I work in higher education, there has been a bit of not a move away from research, but perhaps a move to include and reward teaching within the higher ed sector. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the HEA fellowships, now called Advanced HE. ELICOS staff can apply for these teaching awards at different levels. I'm personally a senior fellow of the HEA. And as part of that application, you need to explicate your teaching philosophy. So again, that's another reason why you might need to write one. Formative purposes are perhaps more obvious. And an individual teaching philosophy can articulate any implicit and espoused beliefs that you might have. Often, as I said earlier, a teaching philosophy is implicit, but it's very useful to make it explicit so that we can really interrogate our espoused beliefs. It's also important so that we can connect theory to practice. So what we're doing in the classroom, is that really connected to theory, or is there a bit of a disconnect there? And it's only really when you do tasks such as writing a teaching philosophy that you consider how those two are connected or not connected. For early career teachers, a teaching philosophy can really help them to focus on these beliefs and also to make sure that they are grounded in theory. But if you're very experienced or your staff are very experienced, what I've called seasoned professionals, it's also a good way to engage them as well as part of their PD, professional development, or their PDR. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it's a good way to show professional growth and change over time, so a longitudinal approach. You might even use it as a component for a CPD. Perhaps you have a CPD, a continuing professional development approach at your college, or maybe you use the English Australia CPD framework. I'll show you later that we have an institutional one at our college, and we've used teaching philosophies as part of that. The other reason that you might write an individual teaching philosophy is because you want to use that as a springboard to creating an institutional philosophy, so a philosophy for your entire college that is shared. And I'm going to show you how we did that later on in the presentation. So what's the point of an institutional philosophy? What formative purposes can that be used for? We'll see later that an institutional teaching philosophy can really provide you with an opportunity to have shared language or nomenclature. So you're all using the same words, the same language, and you have a shared identity. It also allows you to have a shared direction. What do you all believe in? And a shared identity, particularly in doing something that matters, is what Cranston and Keller call it. I really like that phrase, doing something that matters. An institutional teaching philosophy can also improve ownership and agency and even accountability. It's a way of with your shared nomenclature, you can say, well, are we actually doing this? Are we delivering on what we've said we will do? It can also aid your PD planning. So if you're in charge of PD for your centre, by creating an institutional teaching philosophy, you can see where the gaps are, but you could also see where the needs are in order to make sure that you deliver on that teaching philosophy. And also, an institutional teaching philosophy, in turn, can be used as a springboard for other uses. And I'm going to show you how we used it for other uses here at Macquarie. So I think it's time now to consider how we would actually go about writing a teaching philosophy. So nuts and bolts here, let's get practical. So there are a number of different ways that you can do it. There's no one way, there's no perfect way. In the paper, I write about a number of different structures. I'm going to share 2 or 3 different ways with you today. And I'm going to start with the work of Chisholm from 1998. It's a very common approach that Chisholm suggests. First of all, that the teaching philosophy should explicate your conceptualizations of learning. So what is learning? How do you think your students learn? What is learning and how does learning occur? And the second one is conceptualizations of teaching. So I think it's great here that we're focusing first on the students, the learning, and then on the teaching. What do you think your role is as a teacher and in the process of learning? Thirdly, thinking about the goals of your students. What do they need to learn? What should they learn? What are their goals? Where do they want to go? What are they learning English or whatever else they're learning? What are they learning it for? And what level do they need to learn it to? Fourthly, how will you make this happen? How will you help them to operationalize their goals? So this is about the implementation. And it's also a way of considering whether you practice what you preach. If you believe X about learning and Y about teaching, and these are their goals, how are you going to make that happen? How are you going to make that gel? And lastly, a lot of teaching philosophies, in terms of the structure, they suggest that you should finish with an action plan. So that might be your professional development agenda. What's your action plan to get there? How are you going to operationalize your action plan for yourself? So Chisholm's structure has these 5 stages. And what I'm going to show you next is using Chisholm's structure, but using sentence stems to begin. So for example, Chisholm's first stage was conceptualizations of learning. So you could use this sentence stem. As a teacher, I believe that my students learn by ... The second stage was about your conceptualizations of teaching. So you might start with something like, my role as a teacher is to ... The third one was about the goals of your students. So you might write something like, my students need to be able to, want to be able to ... and therefore should learn ... How do you make it happen? So in my classes, I do X, Y, Z because, or in order to. So this is where we connect the conceptualizations of learning, teaching, and their goals. And the fifth one was your action plan. So you might say something like, I need to, or I'm going to develop, work on, find out more about X, Y, Z. And it might be reading more theory. It might be thinking about how to connect theory to practice. It might be talking to peers. There's a whole range of ways in which you could develop your action plan, attend an event, etc., etc. So that's just one example. That's Chisholm's 1998 structure. The next structure I'm going to show you is Chappell 2017. So this is Phil Chappell. I'm sure many of you know Phil well. On face value, his structure looks really quite different. So his first stage is called articulating. And in the articulating stage is where we document and we question our stance. So it's quite similar to what Chisholm mentioned earlier. The second stage he calls interrogating. And this is where we compare theoretical and philosophical orientations. And thirdly, implementing. And this is where we may be making decisions that could lead to change in our practice. So these are the three stages from Chappell's model: articulating, interrogating, implementing. Looks quite different from Chisholm. However, number one is really quite similar in that articulating is really about conceptualizing teaching and learning. And stage three, the implementing, is very much like the action plan that was in the Chisholm structure. I think the key difference here is probably the middle one, the interrogating, which is really about that connection to theory so that we make sure it's grounded in the research and the literature. So I'd like to give you some examples now. This one is an example of using a sentence stem. And the sentence stem that I used in my personal teaching philosophy when we did it institutionally a couple of years ago was very simple. It was simply the sentence stem, I believe. That was it. Not particularly sophisticated, but that's what I started with. And I'm going to show you what I wrote. It's not the best teaching philosophy in the world, but I'm going to let you have a moment to read what I wrote here, predominantly starting with I believe. So have a look at it and then we'll have a little bit of a critique in a moment. Okay, so as you can see, no particular structure really apart from just writing. It was pretty much a first draft with that sentence stem, I believe. It doesn't have an action plan, to be honest, and it has an awful lot of buzzwords. But this was my first attempt, and I'll show you later what we did with these. How we blogged and commented on each other's teaching philosophies. But that's just one example. So that's one way that you can do it using a sentence stem. Another common way of writing a teaching philosophy, or at least of getting started, and you might want to use this in a workshop if you're doing it face-to-face, is the use of metaphor. So, for example, you might have heard of the metaphor of the teacher is the gardener, or the teacher is the chef who's using the raw ingredients, the students, or you're the captain of the ship, chartering unknown choppy waters, or perhaps you're the orchestra conductor. So maybe the students are the ones who are making the music, and it's the teacher who helps bring it all together. They're all playing different instruments, but it can sound beautiful. It takes practice, etc., etc. Here's another one. The teacher as the potter, who is molding the students, again, in the raw ingredients, molding them into something useful, beautiful, an end product. But again, this takes practice to do well. Of course, metaphors eventually they always break down. They're never perfect, but they're a great way to start to think about your teaching philosophy. When we went through this process at my centre, one of my staff had a metaphor, and it was a rather unexpected metaphor. He compared his teaching philosophy to punk rock. So I'm going to share with you now his teaching and learning the punk rock way. So this is my colleague Jan. And if you'd like to just have a quick read of a rather unusual, I've never seen a teaching philosophy quite like this before, but have a quick read of this one. So there you go. You didn't know you were going to hear about punk rock today. I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that we can actually do very much with those 3 chords that were suggested there, but never mind, I'll move on. This is quite an innovative approach, as you can see, which really shows that, you know, there's no single way to write a teaching philosophy. We'll come back to this later, so we'll revisit Jan's punk rock approach later. I just wanted to show you one more, just to show how different some of the approaches were in my team when we did it here. This is someone who's a language teacher, but also a bit of an IT specialist, and he decided that he was going to make it visual, a very different approach. So there was no prose as such, it was mostly imagery and making connections, and then he explained that to us verbally. But the point that I want to make here is that there's no right or wrong way to write a teaching philosophy. Okay, so normally when I do this as a workshop, this is where I say, okay, over to you now, it's your turn to write your teaching philosophy. I'm not going to do that now, but as Sophie said at the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to pause for a few minutes and take some of your questions. I think Sophie's been looking at the chat and she's going to field a couple of questions to me now.
Okay, thanks, Pamela. So the first question, someone's asked how a school's leader deals with the personal teaching philosophy of a staff member that might be conflicted with the institution's philosophy.
Yeah, so I missed the beginning of it. Can you just repeat the beginning?
Yeah, so how would a school's director deal with the personal teaching philosophy confliction?
Right, yeah, good question. Well, I think that's a really good opportunity for a very, good conversation, to have that conversation, ideally in a team, to think about, I mean, you'd have to deal with it incredibly sensitively, but that shows you where you would need to have a conversation, maybe some PD. I guess it's not that unexpected, really. We're all very different people. And I think you've got to engage with it and not close it down, but have the conversation and see whether other people agree or not and why. Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that can lead to other discussions and other PD. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I really liked your idea of using it in annual reviews and having conversations with teachers around their teaching philosophies, and also looking back and seeing how yours has evolved over the past 6 months or year.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is that if it depends how much it differs. I mean, if it's highly problematic, I think that's an opportunity to provide somebody with the literature and to look at, to read more and to consider more if it really is at odds with what you believe. Yeah.
Somebody said, if you have a core belief about teaching, then does the implementation of this change over time?
So as I said earlier, it's a very complex thing, and it tends to become very stable over time. So, I mean, I've been teaching for 30 years now, so I don't really think about it very often, except when I'm required to do this kind of thing. So it can change, but I don't think it changes quickly. And there might be something that needs to stimulate change. So, for example, you did believe something, but then you did a master's degree or something, or something happened in the classroom that really made you question that. But I think it does require you to be a reflective practitioner in order to be able to make that change. So it's not necessarily that the core value won't change, but it's less likely over time unless there's some stimulus to make it change. Good question.
Yeah. There's a comment from someone here who said they use Lego Serious Play to help them unearth their teaching philosophy. I think that's just tapping into the different examples you've given. Someone else has said that punk is not dead.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody has asked how much your teaching philosophy has possibly changed in these times of COVID.
Good question. I hadn't thought about it. I think we've all had to be quite a lot more pragmatic, to be honest. For example, in the early weeks of COVID, I was resisting going online because I personally believed, do I dare put it in the past tense, that the best learning takes place in a face-to-face environment. And I know that I've had to compromise on that, and I know we've had to get creative. So yeah, maybe it has had to change. So more pragmatism, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is
Okay,
a really
maybe
good question.
maybe I'll carry on. Should I carry on?
Yeah, there are a few questions about the benefits to the centre, but I know you're going to cover them now, so I can come back to any of them that don't get answered.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's move on to developing an institutional philosophy, and we will cover off the benefits to the centre here. So you might ask, why would we write an institutional philosophy? So one reason is because in ELICOS, not just ELICOS, higher ed as well, we often have a large number of casual staff, and this might not be the case in your centre, but often when there's a context with high numbers of casual staff, the sense of community or shared identity can be low. And often, not just in education, but in businesses, you often find that people write a values statement or a mission statement for their organization. And the teaching philosophy can work in a very similar way to those kinds of statements, because it can help you create a shared identity, or what the literature calls a meaning quotient. Oh, slight typo there. Need another apostrophe there. So the co-construction with staff, and I'll show you later how we co-constructed, can really improve agency, including for casual staff, but not only, and ownership, and that sense of community. And we really felt that by going through the process. It built rapport, a sense of ownership. And it also provided shared nomenclature, shared language that we could use, which was really useful for a whole range of purposes that I'll talk about shortly. So I'll just talk you through what we did here at Macquarie. The first thing that we did was we held what we called a think tank. And this is a photograph of our senior academic team, our program managers and senior teachers, with a facilitator from the university. So I didn't lead it. I did attend, but I didn't lead it. I didn't want it to feel like it was a top-down approach. I wanted to be there just as another participant. And I wanted us, actually I just inherited the team, and part of the reason was to build rapport and to get to know one another. So I had an external come in, and she had us, the two facilitators had us go through the process I've just outlined with you for the individual teaching philosophy. And then she had us blogging and posting and commenting on the wiki for different people's teaching philosophy. And I'll show you that in a moment. And here in this photograph, you can see us after that event, we all got together again. We did these sessions every week for about 6 weeks, I think. And at this point, we had written our individual philosophies, and we were discussing in 2s and 3s what similarities there were between our individual teaching philosophies. And there were a lot, of course, there were a lot of similarities. And we were trying to build up on the Padlet there, you can see on the screen, on Padlet, we were building up some of the similarities so that we could then create an institutional teaching philosophy that we all believed in. So I said to you that we were blogging and posting and commenting on the wiki. So for example, this was my teaching philosophy that we read earlier. So I posted this, and then happens to be the same colleague, Jan, responded to my teaching philosophy, which is at the bottom third of the page. If you'd just like to have a quick read of Jan's response to my philosophy. Okay, so again, it wasn't the response that I was expecting. Jan actually has a PhD in this area, so it's something he feels very passionate about. So in some cases, the responses that we got on the wiki were highbrow, like this one, you know, talking about Frere's pedagogy of the oppressed and quoting theories such as, you know, Ramsden and etc. But they weren't all highbrow, but I wanted to show you that one, that there are different ways in which you can respond to your colleagues teaching philosophy. And many people responded. I've just chosen a couple of examples. That was one example. And then going back to Jan's punk rock way, we've already read his philosophy. And then the comment at the bottom was actually made by his direct supervisor, where she says, of course, your post is the most fun one. I definitely want to be in your class. So you can see they weren't all highbrow. We had a lot of fun doing this. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the purpose of it was to build rapport, get to know one another, and that certainly happened. And we had quite a lot of fun along the way. This is another thing that we did on the wiki as we were trying to hone down what was our shared beliefs. And again, we started with sentence stems. We believe that, or our students will, or will be, will do, will make. And this is just an extract. The pink is the different responses that different people in the team made. There were about 12 of us in the team. And eventually we had to hone it down, lots of discussion. And eventually we came up with our philosophy. And I could do a drum roll, but I think you already know what the 3 words were since it's in the title of my session today. But our teaching and learning philosophy was engage, empower, evolve. And for each of those, we had a very succinct description. So for engage, it's we engage our students in active learning and critical reflection via our focused delivery model. We empower students to become independent learners capable of adapting to new environments. And we involve through best practice in learning and teaching. So this isn't a perfect teaching and learning philosophy. If I went back now, I would probably make a number of changes to it, and I'll tell you about the lessons learned at the end. But it's quite neat. It has 3 words, which is quite popular these days to have 3 words. They all begin with E, which makes it incredibly memorable. And this is just a very succinct, it's really the essence of what we came up with. And we have other documents that clarify that in more detail and about how we would do that. And I'll show you some documents in a moment. So the actual teaching and learning philosophy itself that looked like this, we made posters of this that we put around the staff room. We actually used this approach when we were doing some curriculum development. We made sure that we went back to the engage, empower, evolve. Are we definitely engaging students in this activity? Are we empowering students in the way that we've designed this course? So it was really critical, not just as a poster and something aspirational, but that was something actually put into practice during the curriculum development project that was underway at the same time. We also used it as the theme for our mini Festival of Learning and Teaching in 2019, where we had about 53 teaching staff across different disciplines, and we had 4 parallel streams. And the theme was engage, empower, evolve. So you can see that it can be used not just something that you stick on the wall and forget about, but that can underpin your curriculum, underpin your PD, underpin a range of teacher-facing activities. In terms of student-facing, we actually put it on our walls. So this is a photograph of our student, a side of our student hub. We've got the corridor on the left with some classrooms, and just the side view of the teaching philosophy that was painted on the wall. You'll notice that the wording is a little bit different, and this is one of the challenges and one of the not mistakes, but perhaps one of the issues with our philosophy. We didn't really consider at the beginning whether it should be just teacher facing, staff facing, or student facing. So when we put this on the wall, we did change the wording a little bit to make it accessible to students. The core philosophy is still there, but we changed the wording to make it understandable to our students. But that's not the only thing that we did. So the teaching and learning philosophy then underpinned the development of our teaching and learning strategy, which was created at the beginning of 2019. So the philosophy itself was developed in 2018. The teaching and learning strategy was created at the beginning of 2019 for the next couple of years. And in that document, I'm not going to show you all of the detail, but in that document, it talks about how we will operationalize evolving and empowering and engaging our students, including PD for our staff. So that's one way in which the teaching philosophy can be a launch to a range of other institutional uses. Another thing, and perhaps the thing that I'm most proud of, is that we used the teaching philosophy to underpin our teaching excellence framework, which is like a CPD framework. And this framework, I'll show you a snapshot of it in a moment. It has 7 standards, all of which were influenced by the teaching philosophy, and 4 performance levels. So the 4 performance levels are in black there, horizontally at the top: developing, proficient, accomplished, and expert. And we decided that ideally anybody who starts working for us would be at the proficient level, ideally, and that people should be working to try to move towards the right side, moving to the right. So if you're proficient, you should be trying to move to accomplished. If you're accomplished, you should be aiming for expert, so that you're always developing, continuous professional development. Down the left side, you can see 3 of the 7 standards that we developed there. And again, these were influenced by our teaching philosophy. And you might wonder where these came from. We didn't create them just entirely, off the top of our heads. They were based on, and it tells you on the right-hand side there, based on the university teaching criteria and the Australian professional standards for teachers. And they're not actually all that different. So we changed some of the wording, amalgamated the 2 and made sure that we owned it and that it reflected our teaching philosophy. So for each of the 7 standards and each of the 4 performance levels, we wrote some criteria that you can see in the dot points there. And we use this with our staff. We use it in PDRs and appraisals. Where do you see yourself? How would you be able to move from one level to the next? What would you need to do in order to get there? How can we help you get there? So it allows for, again, PD planning. So it was very useful to have the teaching philosophy to underpin all of that. So conclusion and lessons learned. So there were a lot of really positives to developing our institutional teaching philosophy. I've mentioned most of them already, but we really did build much more rapport as a team. As I said earlier, I didn't know many of the team members when we first started doing this work. It provided shared nomenclature. So it was actually really interesting as we were developing our curriculum. I could hear people spouting does this engage them? What about empowering? So it was giving them that those shared terms that they could use, and it was coming up time and time again. And it provided us with shared direction. It really got traction with the staff. I've mentioned that it positively impacted the curriculum, and it also impacted our professional development. I showed you the mini festival of learning and teaching, and it allowed us to consider any gaps, particularly around the evolve. In 2019, we focused a lot on training staff on making interactive lessons, very engaging interactive lessons. This year, like everybody else, no doubt, we're focusing on how to transition to online in a very engaging way. The institutional philosophy also legitimized other work that we did, so the teaching and learning strategy, the teaching excellence framework, and underpinned our other institutional activities. However, it wasn't perfect, as I said earlier. We learned a number of lessons. We should have decided really whether the final version was going to be student-facing and staff-facing, or was only going to be staff facing. The engage and empower was okay. I forgot to mention that we did actually go to our students as well as going to staff for feedback on the philosophy. And the students, they understood engage and they understood empower, but they didn't really understand evolve. So that was a bit of a sticky one. Whether the evolve was just for the staff or whether evolve was for students, we intended it to be for both. But that was one that notionally was a bit challenging for students to understand. So I think when you start out, it's a good idea to consider who the audience of the teaching philosophy is in the longer term. We did involve our teachers, but I feel that we should have involved them earlier in the process. And I think that was perhaps because of our context that, as I said earlier, I was trying to get to know the team, and only the senior team were involved in that initial process. And by the time we went to the teachers, we were quite a long way down the track. And I think I would have got better traction from teachers and better uptake if I had involved them earlier in the process. A really important thing, though, is that it is actually the process that's as important, if not more important, than the product. The product is great, you know, you can put it up in all sorts of places, but the process of going through it was very useful, very valuable to us as an institution. So I hope that I've answered some of the questions, but we can revisit them now. In terms of what's in it for us as an institution. I hope that's given you a number of ways of how an institutional philosophy can be useful. So again, usually at this stage, if I'm doing a workshop, I get people to consider whether an institutional teaching philosophy would work for you, or in fact, whether you already have one. I'd love to know. Please put in the chat if you've got an institutional philosophy. I'd love to know that. I don't know how common it is. And just to remind you, I'll open to questions in a minute, but just to remind you that the publication gives you a lot more detail and a lot more of the theory in the English Australia Journal 36, pages 39 to 53. And there is a whole load of references there if you'd like to look at that as well. So maybe I'll just go back to here and hand back over to Sophie and see if we've got any more questions that you'd like me to answer.
Great, thanks Pamela. There are some more questions. Someone's asked if an institutional teaching philosophy is different from a mission statement.
Yeah, good question. I think it is different. I mean, there's mission statements, there's value statements, and there's teaching philosophy. You could call it a mission statement, you could call it a value statement. I guess whatever resonates for your context. I don't have with me exactly a definition of what a mission statement or a value statement is. You might want to go and have a look at what the definition of those usually is. It's not really different. So it would be up to you if you wanted to call it that. We decided to call it a teaching philosophy because we are a teaching institution, and mission statement and value statement can, I don't know, it can feel a little crass perhaps as educators. You know, we're not. I don't feel like we're selling a product. Of course, you know, students do pay money to buy our product, but as educators, I felt that calling it a teaching philosophy would have more resonance with my team than calling it a mission statement or value statement perhaps. And maybe it depends whether you expand it to be not just teachers, but your whole staff. So if it is your whole staff, you might not want to call it a teaching philosophy. You might want to call it a mission statement or value statement.
Okay, great. Someone's asked that when you say you would have involved teachers earlier, when would you have preferred to bring them into the process?
Yeah, good question, because I'm not sure how far down the track we needed to get as a team before we took it to the teachers. Maybe we could have started the institutional section and then gone to the teachers to get them to do their individual teaching philosophies first. So we didn't have the teachers do their individual teaching philosophy. We just introduced them to, we did a workshop, you know, what do we believe in, etc. But we didn't have them write their individual teaching philosophies first. And I think was probably a missed opportunity and a missed step, because we jumped straight to the institutional version.
Yeah, okay. I loved the blogging process you went through with the individual ones, though. That's a great team exercise. Somebody has asked, do you think the process impacted on some of the more tangible aspects of your centre's business? For example, teacher motivation, engagement, uptake of PD, commitment to your teacher excellence framework?
Definitely. We got real momentum in those couple of years, actually. Kind of slowed down a bit now with the, the COVID kind of came to a bit of a crashing halt. But yeah, 2018 and 2019, we saw a massive change, and it really generated, and it became kind of, the momentum was self-generating after a while. But definitely we saw a difference in motivation. We saw far better uptake for PD. I don't know if it was causation or correlation. I don't know. Maybe we were just offering more. But yeah, we saw a definite difference in the culture in the staff room. Definitely. Better uptake of PD. We were also doing a lot of curriculum development at the time. So I think it was palpable, actually, not just tangible. It really did have a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, even something like the teaching excellence framework, being able to refer to that as a teacher or in your discussions with teacher, I'm sure makes a huge difference. So the whole process altogether would be quite transformational.
Yeah.
There's a question from a teacher. If you were to give one piece of advice to a beginning teacher in terms of teaching philosophy, what would it be?
I'd say make it specific. It's not one. Specific and grounded in the theory, and keep learning. Keep learning. Commit to continuous professional development.
In the philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Don't see it as something static. I mean, in my first few years of teaching, I think I did evolve a lot in my beliefs, and take opportunities to really work with other people and talk about their philosophies and ask them why they have that and how have they got to that belief.
Okay. An interesting question here from another teacher. They have said that they find they have to tweak their own teaching philosophy to better suit different employers. For example, they recently had to adopt a totally project-based approach to learning for one employer. Do you think that's selling out?
I think we've got to be pragmatic. It's only selling out if it no longer represents what you believe. I think tweaking is fine. Every job application we write, we tweak. You can't just use the same job. Well, some people do, but then they don't get the job. You can't just use the same application for every single job that you apply for. You've got to consider who they are. So we do that anyway. You've got to consider the end user. If you feel that what you're writing eventually does not represent your beliefs, then yes, that's selling out. But tweaking, no, I don't think so. I think that's just sensible, and it's a pragmatic thing to do.
Okay. Someone's asked if the success of the institutional teaching philosophy, is the success dependent on all teachers agreeing on how students learn?
When you've got a large centre, you're not going to get complete consensus. So I don't think it's possible for everybody to agree. And I manage not just an ELICOS centre, but also foundation and diploma. And I've really noticed that in ELICOS, because we're all English language teachers, we're all linguists, we're much more homogenous in our beliefs. And I found it very interesting when I came over to the college where we've got, the Pathway College has diploma and foundation, and we've got IT teachers and physics teachers and whole range of different disciplines that come with their own beliefs and way of learning and way of thinking and way of creating argument. And for that reason, especially in a context like that, you find that there are so many different points of view. It doesn't mean that one is more valid than another, but I think that's to be expected. What I think you can do is try, where is there consensus? What is there that everybody can agree to? And you build from that.
Yeah, okay. I can imagine it's a complex process. Okay, there's one final question. Somebody's asked about when you showed the wall mural, there was one on the other wall about imposter syndrome. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So we had a project a few years ago when we had a refurb where we decided to look at all of the challenges that students face when they come to Australia, whether they're studying LCOS or foundation or diploma. What are the typical issues that they experience? So things like culture shock, imposter syndrome, the growth mindset, and we have a range of these key issues that we had an artist design, and we put them on the wall. If I just go back to that photo, there it is.
I love that wall.
What is imposter syndrome? So imposter syndrome means that you don't feel good enough, that you feel like you're an imposter. So for example, you know, you're studying a PhD, lots of PhD students feel like this and they go, oh my goodness, I shouldn't be doing this PhD, I'm not good enough, I am not worthy. And lots of students feel like this, you know, they come to Australia and think, oh, I shouldn't be here, I'm not as good as the rest of the students in my class, and I have these issues that nobody else has. That kind of negative thinking is something that we need to let students know is a normal way of thinking, and it's up to us to realize that many of us feel this imposter syndrome. Culture shock is another one. Thinking that growth mindset is another lovely one. So we've got lots of these kind of cartoons around our building on different walls.
Okay, great. Well, it's a fantastic idea because I'm sure it starts a lot of conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, Pamela. Well, it's time to finish up. Thank you so much. I think you've really presented us with a great toolkit for individuals wanting to create their own teaching philosophy, but also you've presented us with a really insightful case study of the process of developing an institution-wide teaching and learning philosophy and the different implications of that. So thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for coming along today as well.
Thanks very much, Sophie, and thank you everybody for attending.